In Pretoria lives a man with the last name du Toit. He speaks Afrikaans, has never been to Europe, and his family has not left southern Africa for 300 years. And in his blood is a nearly untouched 17th century Netherlands, more than in any resident of modern Amsterdam. How is that possible? We're going to break it down now. Imagine a thought experiment. Take the DNA of this Afrikaner and of a Dutchman from Amsterdam. And now imagine that you have a third sample, the genetic portrait of a Dutch sailor from the Rembrandt era, a man who sailed out of Amsterdam in the 1650s. Which of the two modern men will he match more closely? If you bet on the Amsterdam man, you lose. The 17th century sailor will turn out to be closer to the Afrikaner. The Netherlands of the Golden Age dissolved into itself over 370 years, and a small group of people who left on a sailing ship in 1652 preserved it frozen on the other side of the planet. What happened to the Dutch of Rembrandt's era? Those very artists, sailors, and merchants who founded the world's first stock exchange, invented marine insurance, and owned half the world. Their blood should have stayed here, in the veins of modern Amsterdam and Rotterdam. But it is almost gone there. Someone took it away 370 years ago on a single ship and preserved what the Netherlands itself had long since lost. This story is about where it went. In April 1652, 3 ships of the Dutch East India Company, Dromedaris, Reiger, and Goudehoop, approached the Cape of Good Hope. On board are about 90 people. They are led by Jan van Riebeck, a surgeon by training and a trader by calling. They are about to do what dozens of expeditions before them had tried to do, but never completed: found a permanent station at the southern tip of Africa. The plan was strictly practical. Company ships traveled to Indonesia for several months, and crews died in large numbers from scurvy. Fresh water, vegetables, and meat were needed somewhere along the route. The Cape Colony was designed as a halfway provisioning station. No ambitions to build a country, no plans to create a new people, just a garden for passing ships. But those 90 people brought something far more valuable than seeds. They brought their DNA. And no one then suspected that those 90 would become the seed from which, 370 years later, an entire people would grow. Nearly 3 million people who still call themselves by Dutch surnames. In 1652, the Netherlands was at the peak of its power. The stock exchange was booming, the fleet dominated the oceans, Dutch merchants controlled the global spice, silver, and cloth trade, and Europe's best painters worked in Amsterdam and Delft. This was the most Dutch moment in the history of the Netherlands. And it was exactly this genome, the genome of the Golden Age, that sailed away from Texel that winter. The ship carried away a sample without knowing it was a sample, and that capsule would not preserve itself. But 90 people is far too few to create an entire people. The capsule was still barely half full. More than 30 years later, another wave would join it. And that wave would already be speaking something other than Dutch. 1685. Louis XIV abolishes the Edict of Nantes. 300,000 French Protestants become criminals in their own country overnight. Most flee to neighboring states, and most of them go to the religiously tolerant Dutch Republic. The Netherlands welcomes the Huguenots, but there is nowhere to house thousands of people. The company suggests that some of them move even farther, to southern Africa, to the Cape Colony, where farmers and winemakers are needed. The French know grapes. 3 years later, in 1688, about 200 Huguenots board ships and sail to the Cape of Good Hope. Among their belongings are vine cuttings from French vineyards. A few years later, these cuttings will take root in the valleys of Stellenbosch and Franschhoek, and from them will grow South African winemaking, which still exists today. The French brought France to Africa and planted it in the ground by its roots. They also brought their surnames: Du Toit, de Vidier, Marais, Joubert, Leroux, Duplessis. 2 or 3 generations later, these names will be spelled in Dutch, sound Afrikaans, and still carry French DNA within them. Today, there are more Du Toits in Johannesburg's phone directory than in all of France. According to genealogical estimates, By the end of the 18th century, about 25% of Afrikaner genetic input came from Huguenots, about 35% from the first-wave Dutch, and almost as much from Germans, whom the company brought in as soldiers and craftsmen. A northwestern European core was forming, one that in Europe itself would never have merged into a single people. The languages were too different, the churches too different. But on the far side of the world from Europe, in a small colony where everyone spoke one Dutch dialect and prayed in one church, these three branches fused into one. By 1700, there were already about 1,300 free burghers living in the colony. All of them were descendants of those first waves. The capsule was now almost completely filled with European material. And along with these people, something else had already entered it. A tiny mutation that, 300 years later, doctors would call the Boer disease and use to trace the name of an ancestor. But more on that later. First, the capsule would absorb something the Afrikaners would long avoid saying out loud. The Cape Colony was never purely European. From the very first decades, the company brought slaves here, from Bengal, from Ceylon, from Java, from Madagascar, from East Africa. In the Cape slave market, you could hear Malay, Bengali, Malagasy, and Portuguese. These people worked in settlers' homes, cooked food, and cared for children. And sometimes they married their owners. At the same time, the native inhabitants of these lands lived here too, the Khoisan, hunter-gatherers with their own languages, full of clicks and clacking sounds that do not exist in any European language. Their women also became wives and mothers in the families of the early settlers. The colony was male-dominated. There were few Dutch women on the ships. The overwhelming majority of the first settlers arrived without wives, and during the colony's first century, every second European who left descendants had children with a local or imported woman. This was not an anomaly, but the norm of the early colony. Today, you can read that in the DNA. A modern genomic analysis of 77 Afrikaners showed a clear picture. The average Afrikaner has about 95% European ancestry. The remaining roughly 5% comes from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Khoisan groups. 5%. A thin but continuous line of Africa and Asia in the blood of a people who for 3 centuries considered themselves a pure product of Europe. The most important thing about that number is how the mixture is distributed. It is spread evenly across the entire sample. That means it entered the capsule early, during the 18th century, before the colony finally sealed itself off. Now it is part of every Afrikaner's genome. At the same time, another group was forming in the Cape, Cape-colored and Cape Malay. In them, the mixing was much stronger. Maternal lines mostly African and Asian, paternal lines European. 2 neighboring experiments running under different rules. By the end of the 18th century, the composition of the capsule had fully taken shape. Dutch, Germans, French, and a small but evenly distributed non-European layer. This mixture now needed only one thing: sealing, so that it would no longer be diluted by new inflows from outside. And the sealing would come, just not by choice. In 1795, an enemy would arrive in the Cape. 1795. The Dutch East India Company is on the verge of bankruptcy. The French Revolution is tearing Europe apart. The British Navy takes advantage of the chaos and seizes the Cape Colony. The Dutch briefly regain it, then lose it for good. No more new Dutch settlers will sail to the Cape from the homeland. The capsule is closed. Inside it are about 20,000 people speaking a Dutch dialect that is already beginning to turn into a separate language, Afrikaans. Outside are the British, who will bring English, Indian laborers brought to work the sugar plantations, and the peoples of inland Africa, whose lands the settlers have not yet entered. British migrants will settle in the Cape by the thousands, but very few will enter the Afrikaner community. The Afrikaners will close in on themselves. In 1835, what enters their history as the Great Trek begins. Picture it. Tens of thousands of Boers, with their wives, children, and Bibles, load their belongings onto ox-drawn wagons. Herds of cattle, the wailing of cemeteries at departure, and endless dust on the roads leading north. An entire people sets out to leave British rule behind. They cross the Drakensberg Mountains, cross rivers, cross lands where Zulu spears meet them. And there, deep in the continent, they found their own republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. They carry the capsule deeper, into the very heart of Africa. And there, in small rural communities, they begin reproducing within a narrow circle of related families. A neighbor marries a neighbor's niece. A farmer's son marries a farmer's daughter across the ravine. That is how what geneticists call the founder effect arises. When a small group splits off from a larger one and rapidly grows, any rare traits that happen to be in that small group multiply along with it. And now, about that mutation we mentioned earlier. Among Afrikaners, very rare diseases multiplied this way. The best known is porphyria, a skin and liver disease that is seen hundreds of times more often in South Africa than anywhere else in the world. Imagine a patient who cannot stay in the sun. The skin breaks out and burns from any bright light. Today, in hospitals in Johannesburg and Cape Town, doctors know this disease as the Boer disease. This is not superstition. It is a medical fact. Scientists found the specific mutation responsible for most cases. It is called R59W, and they traced it through genealogies to a small group of European settlers from the late 17th century. Every modern carrier of this mutation in South Africa is a direct descendant of that group. The disease became the surname of an ancestor, written into DNA. The capsule is preserved and labeled. But while the Afrikaners were being preserved in southern Africa, back in their homeland, the Netherlands, the opposite was beginning. The homeland started erasing itself. The Netherlands of Rembrandt was a closed country. Not by its borders. Those were among the most open in Europe. Closed by its population makeup. The overwhelming majority of people were born and died in the same village or the same city block. Mixing happened slowly and mostly within the group. A Frisian married a Frisian woman. An Amsterdam man married an Amsterdam woman. That continued for 500 years. It was still true in Rembrandt's time, and it remained so almost until the end of the 19th century. That is why the Dutch genome of the Golden Age was a recognizable whole. The 20th century wiped all of that away. First, industrialization. Peasants from villages moved en masse to cities, and regional differences that had built up over centuries began to blur within a few generations. Then 2 world wars. Then the collapse of the colonies. In 1949, Indonesia gains independence. Imagine the port of Rotterdam in those years. Every week, ships dock and families step off them. White Dutch, mixed-race people, children with Asian facial features, speaking Dutch with a Malay accent. Over a few years, about 300,000 people, Dutch and mixed-race people born in the colony during its 3 centuries of existence, arrive in the Netherlands en masse. They were called Indo, Dutch Indonesians. Many of them had never been to the Netherlands, but legally they were citizens. They arrive and blend into the population of the homeland, bringing with them Asian genetic lines in numbers the Netherlands had never seen in its entire history. In 1975, Suriname gains independence. Tens of thousands of Surinamese, descendants of slaves and Indian indentured workers, moved to the Netherlands in the first years after independence, and together with their children and grandchildren, the Surinamese diaspora in the country today numbers several 100,000 people. From the 60s and 70s onward, the country also brings in large numbers of guest workers from Turkey and Morocco. They come for 2 or 3 years to earn money, stay for 30, and bring their families over. By the beginning of the 21st century, in one Amsterdam neighborhood you could hear 5 languages on a single street: Dutch, Turkish, Moroccan Arabic, Sranan Tongo from Suriname, and Bahasa Indonesia from the grandchildren of the Indo. And this is what today's demographic research shows. The urban population of the Netherlands changed before the eyes of just 1 or 2 generations. In modern Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the share of residents with a migration background, meaning those who themselves, or at least one of whose parents, were born outside the Netherlands, reaches about half. Among them, a significant share comes from countries outside Europe: Turkey, Morocco, Suriname, the former Dutch East Indies, and the Antilles. The old northwestern European core, which 300 years ago made up almost the entire urban population, is now just one of several components. In rural areas, the core has been preserved better. But even there, time, internal mixing, and constant migration to the cities and back still work. A modern Dutchman is no longer Rembrandt's Dutchman. He is a 21st century Dutchman in whose blood northwestern Europe, Indonesia, Suriname, Turkey, and Morocco coexist peacefully. The composition has changed so much that specialists say the Dutch genome of the Golden Age can no longer be found in the Netherlands itself in its original 17th century proportions. But in the Southern Hemisphere, in the small rural towns of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, it all this time sat quietly in a preserved capsule. It just needed to be opened. In the 21st century, thousands of Afrikaners have taken DNA tests. Thousands of modern Dutch people have too. Studies have appeared that make it possible to compare different groups with reference samples from European populations, and with those rare samples of ancient DNA that can be extracted from archaeological finds. The picture is clear. Genetically, Afrikaners are closest to northwestern Europe, to the Dutch, Germans, and French, but in a very specific proportion that reflects precisely the makeup of the late 17th century colonists. Modern residents of the large Dutch cities have already moved noticeably away from that reference proportion because of all the post-war migrations. Direct archaeological DNA data on the Dutch of the Golden Age are still scarce, and any reconstruction remains approximate. No one has yet analyzed a 17th century sailor from a sunken ship. For now, that is only a thought experiment. But everything scientists already have points in one direction. If such a comparison is ever made, the 17th century sailor will turn out to be closer to the Afrikaner, not to the average resident of modern Amsterdam. So that is where it went. The Dutch DNA of Rembrandt's era did not disappear into nothing. It was carried away. 90 people on 3 ships, then 200 Huguenots, then a capsule sealed for 2 centuries by a bottleneck and labeled by ancestral disease. Today, that capsule is carried by nearly 3 million Afrikaners. And in their blood, the Netherlands of the Golden Age has been preserved more fully than in the Netherlands itself. There is no normative meaning in this. No one alive today is a truer Dutchman than anyone else. Any nation is the sum of all its waves, including the latest ones. A modern Amsterdam resident whose blood includes Indonesia and Morocco is just as Dutch as any of his ancestors, simply a Dutchman of the 21st century. And the Afrikaners are Dutchmen of the 17th. They live where no one expected to find them, under a different sky from the one under which their founders were born. But Rembrandt's Netherlands never disappeared. It sailed away on a sailing ship 370 years ago, and it is still sailing. If you enjoyed this journey through time, hit like and subscribe. There are many more stories ahead about peoples whose DNA remembers more than they do.